There comes a time in every woman's life when the world stops seeing her, when she becomes invisible even to those she once cared for. Sigrid knew this feeling well. The village healer who had delivered their children and tended their wounds, now forgotten in her widowhood. In the ancient Norse forests where old gods still breathe, she wanders deeper than any villager dares. There she meets Bjarnulf, a giant warrior whose scars tell stories of centuries past. When he speaks to her of things long lost, desire, purpose, the fire still burning within her, everything changes. Their bond awakens something powerful, but it also threatens to fulfill dark prophecies that could destroy her village. The elders fear what Bjarnulf represents, and they fear what Sigrid might become. Will she return to the safety of being forgotten, or embrace a destiny that could make her legendary? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient bone needle felt cold between Sigrid's weathered fingers as she knelt beside the fevered child. Little Eric's breath came in shallow gasps, his small chest barely rising beneath the rough woolen blanket his mother had wrapped around him. The cottage reeked of sickness and fear, a smell Sigrid had grown to know too well in recent months. "Please," whispered Astrid, the boy's mother, her young face streaked with tears. "The new healer says there's nothing more to be done, but I remember how you saved my sister's baby 3 winters past." Sigrid's hands moved with practiced grace, feeling for the child's pulse, pressing gently against his burning forehead. The bone needle, carved from the rib of a great elk her late husband Gunnar had brought down in their early years of marriage, had been her constant companion through decades of healing work. Its surface was worn smooth from countless procedures, blessed by her touch and sanctified by service to her people, but now even this sacred tool felt powerless in her grasp. "The fever has taken too strong a hold," Sigrid said softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience and sorrow. "His spirit is already walking between worlds." Astrid's sob filled the small space. "But you're the true healer. Everyone knows it. These new women, they know herbs and poultices, but you have the touch, the gift. The gift." How many times had Sigrid heard those words? Once they had filled her with pride and purpose. Once they had meant respect, reverence, a place of honor in the community she had served for more than 40 winters. Now those same words felt like accusations, reminders of powers that seemed to have abandoned her along with everything else she had lost. Sigrid continued her ministrations, using the bone needle to create tiny punctures along specific points of the child's body, an ancient technique passed down through generations of healers in her family line. But where once her touch had brought comfort and healing energy, now there was only the mechanical motion of old knowledge, applied without the spark that had once made her legendary. The child's breathing grew more labored. His small hand, hot with fever, grasped weakly at Sigrid's weathered fingers. She stayed with him until the end, as she had stayed with so many others in recent months. As dawn broke through the cottage's single window, little Eric drew his final breath. Astrid's wails of grief echoed through the village, carrying with them an accusation that no one spoke aloud, but everyone understood. Sigrid the healer had failed again. By the time Sigrid emerged from the cottage, a small crowd had gathered. She recognized each face, people she had helped birth, had tended through illness, had comforted through loss. Now their expressions ranged from pity to suspicion, and more than a few carried the unmistakable look of blame. 3 children, this winter, muttered Elder Tormund, his grizzled beard frosted with morning ice. 3 children, who might have lived if the curse hadn't taken hold. The curse, another word that followed Sigrid like a shadow these days. They meant her widowhood, of course. The belief that had grown stronger with each failed healing, each life lost under her care. In Norse tradition, a woman who outlived her husband carried misfortune, especially one whose healing gifts seemed to have soured into something darker. Sigrid pulled her worn cloak tighter around her shoulders and began the walk back to her empty cottage. The village of Ironhold spread before her in the pale morning light, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings clustered around a central square, smoke rising from chimneys as families began their daily routines. It was the only home she had ever known, yet it felt increasingly foreign to her now. Her own dwelling sat at the village's edge, where the carefully tended gardens gave way to wild forest. Once it had bustled with activity, patients seeking her help, apprentices learning her craft, neighbors stopping by for conversation and counsel. Now it stood silent, its herb garden gone to seed, its windows dark. Inside, memories haunted every corner. The great oak table where Gunnar had carved runes of protection still dominated the main room, though now it served only to display her collection of unused healing implements. The bed they had shared for 25 winters felt vast and cold. Without his presence, most painful of all was the smaller room they had prepared for children who never came, until Sigrid's advanced age had made such hopes impossible, or so they had thought. She placed the bone needle in its carved wooden case, handling it with the reverence due a sacred object, though she wondered if it would ever again channel the healing power it once had. The case itself was a work of art, crafted by Gunnar during the early years of their marriage, inlaid with silver threads that formed protective symbols, and decorated with tiny carved figures representing the spirits of healing. Gunnar, even. Now 3 winters after his death in the great storm, she spoke to him each evening as if he still sat beside their fire. "Another child lost today," she said to the empty room, settling into her chair with a cup of bitter tea brewed from the last of her medicinal herbs. "Little Eric, Astrid's boy. The fever took him just as it took Steen's daughter last month, and the blacksmith's grandson before that." In her mind, she could hear his response, gentle, reassuring, full of the practical wisdom that had first drawn her to the young fisherman who had courted her so persistently in their youth. "You've saved more lives than most healers see in a lifetime, my heart," his voice seemed to whisper. "Perhaps it's not your gifts that have changed, but something else, something you haven't yet understood." But understanding felt beyond her reach. All she knew was that the respect and purpose that had defined her existence had crumbled along with her husband's ship in that terrible storm. The village had tolerated her grief for the first winter, even shown sympathy, but as her healing successes grew rarer and her failures more common, tolerance had shifted to suspicion, and suspicion to outright blame. The new healer, a woman named Freydis, who had arrived from a neighboring settlement, possessed adequate knowledge and a young woman's confidence, but she lacked the deep intuitive connection to the healing arts that had made Sigrid legendary. Still, her successes, modest though they were, seemed miraculous compared to Sigrid's recent failures, and the village had begun to transfer their trust accordingly. Sigrid understood the practical wisdom in this shift, even as it broke her heart. A healer who could not heal was worse than useless. She was dangerous, carrying with her the taint of failed hope and accumulated sorrow. As the day wore on, she moved through her empty routines with mechanical precision. She tended her neglected garden, gathering what few herbs still grew in the hard-packed earth. She mended tears in her clothing and darned holes in her woolen stockings. She prepared a simple meal and ate it without tasting, her thoughts consumed by questions that had no answers. Why had her gifts abandoned her? Was it truly the curse of widowhood or something deeper? Had she somehow angered the spirits that guided healing hands? Or was this simply the natural course of things? An aging woman whose time of usefulness had passed, making way for younger, stronger practitioners. The questions circled in her mind like wolves around a dying fire, offering no comfort, no resolution. As evening shadows began to lengthen, Sigrid found herself drawn to the silver-threaded braid that hung above their marriage bed. Gunnar had woven it himself on their wedding day, following a tradition that bound couples together with hair from both bride and groom, twisted with precious metal blessed by the village priest. It was meant to symbolize lives intertwined, destinies shared, love that would endure beyond death itself. She touched the braid gently, feeling the cool smoothness of the silver threads against her fingertips. In its intricate weaving, she could still see the young woman she had once been, confident in her gifts, secure in her place in the world, beloved by a man whose strength had been her anchor through every storm. That woman felt like a stranger. Now, the sound of footsteps outside her door interrupted her melancholy reverie. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Perhaps someone needed her help. Perhaps her gifts might yet prove useful. But when she opened the door, she found only young Olaf, the blacksmith, his broad face creased with concern. "Sigrid," he said, his voice gentle despite his imposing size. "I wanted to speak with you about this morning." She stepped aside to let him enter, grateful for any human contact that didn't carry accusations or pity. "You did all you could for the boy," Olaf continued, settling his bulk onto one of her simple wooden stools. "I remember when you saved my Greta from the birthing. Viva, without you I'd have lost both wife and child that night." The memory was bittersweet. Greta had indeed lived through that difficult birth, only to die 2 winters later in a hunting accident, trampled by a wounded boar that Olaf himself had been tracking. Since then, the blacksmith had raised his daughter alone, and his understanding of loss gave weight to his words. "But that was before," Sigrid replied, pouring him a cup of the bitter tea, "before the curse took hold, before my touch became a harbinger of death rather than healing." Olaf's weathered hands wrapped around the cup, steam rising between them, like incense. "I don't believe in curses, Sigrid. I believe in seasons, times of plenty and times of want, times when our efforts bear fruit and times when they don't. Maybe this is just your winter season and spring will come again." His kindness was almost harder to bear than the villagers' suspicion. At least, suspicion felt honest, acknowledging the reality of her failures. Kindness felt like denial, like refusing to see what had become painfully obvious to everyone else. 3 children, Olaf. 3 families destroyed while I stood by helpless. How can I call myself a healer when I bring only death? The same way I call myself a blacksmith when sometimes my blades crack in the fire, he replied firmly. The same way fishermen still go to sea even after storms take their boats. We are what we are, Sigrid, not just what we accomplish. But even Olaf's steady presence couldn't quiet the voices of doubt that had taken residence in her mind. After he left, promising to bring her fresh bread from his daughter's baking, Sigrid found herself staring out her window toward the dark line of thornwood forest that bordered their village. The thornwood was ancient beyond memory, a place where old stories claimed giants once walked and gods still listened to mortal prayers. Most villagers avoided its deeper reaches, content to gather berries and hunt small game near its edges. But Sigrid had always felt drawn to its shadows and mysteries. Even as a child, perhaps it was time to venture deeper than she had ever dared before. Perhaps in the heart of the ancient forest, where legend said the old powers still flowed, she might find answers to the questions that tormented her. Or perhaps she might find nothing at all, which might be an answer in itself. She fingered the silver-threaded braid one more time, drawing what comfort she could from its familiar weight. Then, with a decision that surprised her with its suddenness, she began gathering supplies for a journey into the unknown depths of the thornwood. If her gifts had truly abandoned her, if her time in this world was ending, she would at least choose how that ending came. And if there was still some spark of the old power left within her, some remnant of the healer she had once been, perhaps the ancient forest would help her find it again. The bone needle went into her pack first, wrapped carefully in soft leather. Whatever she found in the thornwood, she would face it as a healer, or die in the attempt. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like the breath of sleeping spirits as Sigrid ventured deeper into the thornwood than she had ever dared. Each step took her further from the familiar paths where village children gathered berries and hunters tracked deer, into the realm where ancient trees grew so thick their canopy blocked the sun, and shadows held secrets older than memory. Her leather pack felt heavy against her shoulders, weighted with the bone needle, dried provisions, and a small collection of her remaining healing herbs. But it was not the physical burden that made her steps uncertain. It was the growing awareness that she was crossing invisible boundaries, entering spaces where the old laws still held sway. The deeper she went, the stranger the forest became. Here, frost clung to leaves that should have fallen weeks ago, creating a crystalline beauty that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. There, streams flowed uphill in defiance of natural law, their waters singing with voices that spoke in languages she almost understood. The very air felt thicker, charged with power that made her skin tingle and her heart race with anticipation. It was beside one of these impossible streams, where the water carved spirals in the earth as it flowed toward the sky, that she found the runestone fragment. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a broken piece of ancient granite, half buried beneath a carpet of moss and fallen leaves. But something about its position, nestled against the roots of an oak tree, whose trunk was wider than her cottage, called to her attention. As she knelt to examine it more closely, she noticed the faint traces of carved symbols along its weathered surface. Runes, old ones carved in a style she recognized from her grandmother's stories, but had never seen with her own eyes. The moment her fingers touched the stone, warmth flooded through her palm. Not the gentle heat of sun-warmed rock, but something deeper, more alive. It pulsed like a heartbeat, like blood flowing through ancient veins. The whispers began as she lifted the fragment from its resting place. At first, they were so soft, she thought they might be wind moving through the leaves overhead. But gradually, they resolved into words. Not Norse, not any language she recognized, yet somehow perfectly comprehensible. They spoke of recognition, of awakening, of purposes long delayed but never forgotten. One who remembers, the voices seemed to say. One who carries the old blood, though she knows it not. Sigrid's hand trembled as she held the stone, its warmth spreading up her arm and into her chest. For the first time in months she felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. That was when the shadow fell across her. She looked up to see a figure emerging from between the massive tree. Trunks, a man, but larger than any man she had ever seen. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block the filtered sunlight, his presence commanding despite the gentleness of his approach. Scars crisscrossed his exposed arms and chest, telling stories of battles fought and survived. Yet there was nothing threatening in his demeanor. His hair hung in heavy braids past his shoulders, streaked with silver that spoke of age beyond counting. His beard was full and well kept, framing a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the ancient monuments that dotted the northern lands. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue like winter ice, yet warm with an intelligence and kindness that seemed to see directly into her soul. "I wondered when you would come," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying an accent she couldn't place. "I have been waiting a very long time." Sigrid's first instinct was to run, but something in his manner held her still. Despite his imposing size, he approached with the careful movements of one accustomed to frightening others, taking pains not to appear threatening. "You speak as though you know me," she managed, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. A smile touched his lips, gentle, almost sad. "I know the scent of awakening power. I know the look of one who has been cast aside by those too small to recognize her worth. And most clearly of all," he paused, his nostrils flaring slightly as he drew in her scent, "I can smell that you are fertile." The words should have shocked her, should have sent her fleeing back toward the village and safety. Instead, they stirred something deep within her that had been dormant for far too long. Heat rose in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from recognition of a truth she had refused to acknowledge. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I'm past 50 winters. My time for bearing children ended years ago." "Your time for bearing ordinary children, perhaps," he replied, settling his massive frame onto a fallen log with surprising grace. "But there are other kinds of fertility, other kinds of power waiting to be born. The runestone called to you, because it recognizes what you are, even if you do not." He gestured to the fragment still warm in her palm. That piece broke away from the mother stone centuries ago, during the last great awakening. It has been waiting here ever since, knowing that eventually one of the blood would come to claim it. One of the blood? Sigrid's grip tightened on the stone, its pulse seeming to match the racing of her heart. "Giant blood," he said simply, as though discussing the weather. "Diluted by generations of mixing with ordinary folk, but still there, still waiting for the right moment to assert itself." The concept was so far beyond her understanding that she could only stare at him. Giants were creatures of legend, of children's stories told around winter fires. They had no place in the world of healing herbs and village politics, of lost husbands and failed gifts. Yet the warmth of the runestone in her palm seemed to pulse with agreement, and something deep in her bones recognized the truth of his words, even as her mind rejected them. "My name is Bjarnulf," he continued, apparently content to let her process this revelation at her own pace. "I am what you might call the last of the old bloodlines, though perhaps not the last, if what I sense about you is correct. You're saying you're actually—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. "A giant? Yes, though we preferred the term Jotun in the old tongue. Your people shortened it over the centuries, made it sound crude and threatening. We were never monsters, Sigrid. We were simply larger, longer-lived, more in tune with the old powers that your ancestors have slowly forgotten." He knew her name. Somehow this impossible man, this giant, knew who she was. "I've watched your village from afar for many years," Bjarnulf explained, noting her surprise. "Watched you grow from a gifted child into a powerful healer. Watched you love and lose and grieve. I knew that someday, when the pain of your isolation grew great enough, you would venture deep enough into the forest to find what has always been waiting for you." "And what is that?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Purpose," he said simply. "Power. The chance to become what you were always meant to be, instead of the pale shadow of yourself that grief and doubt have made you." His words struck her heart like arrows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. How long had it been since anyone had spoken to her about potential rather than failure? How long since someone had suggested that her struggles might be growing pains rather than decline? "I don't understand any of this," she admitted. "How can you speak of giant blood and old powers when I can barely save a fevered child? How can you talk of fertility when I'm decades past childbearing? Nothing you say makes sense." Bjarnulf rose from the log and approached her slowly, his movement still careful and unthreatening. When he was close enough to touch, he extended one massive hand, palm up. "Give me the stone for a moment," he requested gently. Reluctantly, she placed the rune-stone fragment in his palm. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded with sensation. Light blazed behind her eyes, not the harsh glare of lightning, but the warm, golden radiance of sunrise on water. Power flowed between them, ancient and vast, recognizing itself across the bridge of their connected flesh. For one impossible moment, she felt what he felt, the weight of centuries, the loneliness of being the last of his kind, the joy of finally finding another who carried even a trace of the old bloodlines, and beneath it all, threading through the cosmic vastness of his existence, she sensed something achingly familiar. The same loneliness that had driven her into the forest. The same need for connection and purpose that had been eating away at her soul. When he released her hand and returned the stone, She was trembling. "Now do you begin to understand?" he asked softly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Whatever rational explanations her mind might construct, her body knew the truth of what had just passed between them. This was no madness or delusion. This was awakening. "What happens now?" she whispered. Bjarnulf smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, Sigrid felt hope kindle in her chest like a flame cupped against the wind. "Now," he said, "we discover what you're truly capable of." 3 days had passed since Sigrid's encounter in the deep forest, and the runestone fragment had not left her side. She kept it wrapped in soft cloth within her healing pouch, where its steady warmth provided constant reminder that the impossible conversation with Bjarnulf had been real, not some fever dream born of grief and isolation. Yet returning to village life felt like donning clothes that no longer fit properly. Everything seemed smaller somehow, the cottages more cramped, the daily routines more petty, the familiar faces more closed and suspicious than before. She moved through her usual activities with growing restlessness, as though her body remembered a different way of being and chafed at the constraints of her former existence. The restlessness might have continued indefinitely, if not for Astrid's desperate pounding on her door just before dawn on the 4th day. "Sigrid, please!" The young mother's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "It's Eric's little brother, Leif. The same fever that took Eric. It has him now, and it's worse, much worse." Sigrid's blood chilled. She had delivered Leif barely 2 years ago, had watched him grow from a fretful infant into a sturdy toddler with his father's stubborn chin and his mother's gentle eyes. The thought of losing another of Astrid's children to the winter sickness that seemed to be stalking their village made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "What does Freydis say?" Sigrid asked, though she was already reaching for her healing supplies. "She's tried everything she knows," Astrid replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Willow bark for the fever, elderberry syrup for his chest, even the precious honey from the southern merchants. Nothing helps. His breathing grows more labored each hour, and his fever," she shuddered, "his fever burns like fire from within." Sigrid hesitated, her hand hovering over the bone needle in its carved case. The last 3 children she had tried to treat had died despite her efforts, and each failure had carved deeper wounds in her. Confidence. What if her touch truly had become cursed? What if her presence at Leif's bedside hastened rather than prevented his death? But the desperate love in Astrid's eyes decided the matter. Whatever curse might have fallen upon her gifts, she could not turn away from a suffering child. The walk to Astrid's cottage took them through the village square, where early risers were already beginning their daily routines. Sigrid felt their eyes following her progress, heard the whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when she drew near. Word of her involvement in little Eric's final hours had spread, as such news always did in a small community, and opinion remained divided on whether her presence had been mercy or misfortune. Inside the modest dwelling, the scene was heartbreakingly familiar. Leif lay on a bed of furs and blankets, his small chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. His face was flushed with fever, but his lips had taken on the bluish tinge that spoke of lungs struggling to draw sufficient air. His father, Bjorn, sat beside the bed with the hollow-eyed look of a man watching helplessness destroy everything he held dear. Sigrid knelt beside the child and placed her hands gently on his forehead and chest. The fever was indeed worse than Eric's had been, not just hot, but carrying with it an odd quality that made her fingertips tingle. It was almost as though some foreign presence had taken residence in the boy's small body, burning him from within. She opened her healing pouch and withdrew the bone needle, unwrapping it with reverent care. As she did so, the runestone fragment brushed against her fingers, and warmth spread up her arm like liquid sunshine. For a moment, her vision seemed to shift, allowing her to see patterns of light and shadow moving within the child's body, the fever burning in harsh red spirals, but also something else. something that pulsed with gentle blue-white radiance around the edges. The sight startled her so much that she nearly dropped the needle. Never before had her healing sight manifested so clearly, so visibly. Yet the vision felt natural, as though her eyes were simply remembering how to see what had always been there. Working with newfound precision, she began the traditional treatment, creating tiny punctures along the child's meridian lines to release trapped energy and allow the fever to break. But this time, she could see the results of her work in those strange patterns of light. Where her needle touched, the harsh red spirals began to soften and disperse, while the gentle blue-white glow grew stronger. The runestone fragment continued to pulse with warmth in her pouch, and she found herself drawing upon that heat, channeling it through the bone needle into the child's struggling system. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced, as though the ancient stone was feeding her power she had never known she possessed. "His breathing," whispered Astrid. "Look, his breathing is easier." It was true. Leif's chest rose and fell more. Slowly, more naturally, the bluish tinge began to fade from his lips, replaced by healthier pink. His fever, while still present, no longer radiated the terrible heat that had threatened to consume him. But as Sigrid worked, she became aware of a growing problem. The healing was demanding more from her than she had to give. Her own strength was flowing out through the needle, leaving her increasingly dizzy and weak. The ancient techniques her grandmother had taught her were meant to guide the body's own healing processes, not to pour the healer's life force directly into the patient. Yet, she could not stop. The child was responding, fighting back against the fever with renewed strength. To withdraw her support now might mean losing him when victory was so close at hand. That was when she felt the presence. It started as a whisper of wind that touched no one else in the room, carrying with it the scent of deep forest and ancient stone. Then came the sensation of vast strength offered freely, power beyond her imagining flowing into her flagging reserves like water poured into a nearly empty well. "Accept what is offered." A familiar, deep voice seemed to whisper in her. "Mind, you need not face this alone, Bjarnulf." Somehow, despite the miles that separated them, he was lending her his strength, supplementing her depleted energy with reserves drawn from his centuries of accumulated power. The connection felt as natural as breathing, as though invisible threads had been woven between them during their brief contact in the forest. With his strength supporting her, Sigrid was able to complete the healing. The last of the red spirals dissipated under her needle's touch, replaced by the steady blue-white glow of healthy life force. Leif's fever broke in a rush of sweat that soaked through his blankets, and his breathing settled into the deep, regular rhythm of natural sleep. "He'll live," Sigrid said, though the words came out barely above a whisper. The effort had drained her more completely than any healing she had ever attempted, yet she felt strangely exhilarated rather than depleted. Astrid fell to her knees beside the bed, sobbing with relief as she touched her son's now cool forehead. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you." But Sigrid barely heard the gratitude. Her attention was focused on the healing pouch at her side, where something extraordinary had occurred. Reaching inside, she found not just the runestone fragment she had placed there, but an entire leather pouch filled with herbs she had never seen before. Plants that should not exist in the depths of winter, species that grew only in distant lands or in the realm of legend itself. The herbs radiated the same gentle warmth as the runestone, and she knew instinctively that they possessed healing properties far beyond anything in her previous experience. Somehow, through their connection, across the miles of forest, Bjarnulf had not only lent her his strength, but provided her with the tools she needed to save Leif's life. As she carefully rewrapped the precious herbs, Sigrid realized that everything had changed. The failed healer who had entered this cottage was gone, replaced by someone who had accessed powers beyond ordinary understanding. The question now was what she would do with this newfound ability, and what price such gifts might ultimately demand. Word of Leif's miraculous recovery spread through Ironhold like wildfire, rekindling whispers that had been dormant since Sigrid's recent failures. But these new whispers carried a different quality, awe mixed with uncertainty, wonder touched by fear. The woman who had been unable to save 3 children in as many months had somehow pulled a fourth back from death's threshold using methods that defied explanation. Elder Tormund was among the first to arrive at her cottage, his weathered face creased with suspicion as he examined the impossible herbs she had used in Leif's treatment. "Where did you acquire these?" he demanded, holding a sprig of winter-blooming valerian that should not have existed for another 4 months. "This grows only in the high mountains during the warmest days of summer." Sigrid hesitated, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch the runestone fragment through the fabric of her dress. How could she explain the supernatural connection that had brought the herbs to her? How could she speak of giants and ancient bloodlines to a man who barely tolerated the minor superstitions that had always guided village life? "They were a gift," she said finally, "from someone who understood what was needed." The elder's eyes narrowed. "What someone? There are no traders passing through in midwinter, no messengers from distant settlements. These herbs appeared as if by magic, Sigrid, and magic always carries a price." Before she could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Astrid stood in the doorway, her face bright with gratitude and something else. Hope, perhaps, or the beginnings of renewed faith. "Forgive the interruption, Elder," she said with a respectful bow, "but my sister's child has taken ill with the same fever that nearly claimed my Leif. She begs for Sigrid's help." Tormund's scowl deepened. "One successful treatment does not erase a season of failures. Perhaps it would be wiser to seek help from Freydis, whose methods we understand." "Freydis has already seen the child," Astrid replied, her voice carefully neutral. "She says there is little to be done. The fever progresses too quickly for ordinary treatments." Sigrid felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She could refuse, claim that Leif's healing had been mere luck, return to the safety of her marginalized existence, or she could accept the challenge and risk exposing the supernatural nature of her newfound abilities. The choice was made for her when she felt the familiar whisper of wind that touched only her, carrying the scent of deep forest and the suggestion of vast strength held in readiness. "I'll come," she said, gathering her healing supplies with hands that trembled only slightly. The second healing proved even more dramatic than the first. The child, a girl of perhaps 5 years, was further advanced in her illness than Leif had been, her small body racked with convulsions that spoke of fever-induced seizures. Yet when Sigrid laid hands on her and reached for the connection that bound her to Bjarnulf, power flowed through her with even greater clarity than before. This time, she could not only see the patterns of sickness and health within the child's body, but actively reshape them with her touch. The bone needle became merely a focus for energies that seemed to originate from somewhere far beyond her own reserves. Within an hour, the convulsions had ceased, the fever broken, and the child was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. But the healing left Sigrid profoundly changed in ways that went beyond mere exhaustion. As she walked home through the village streets, she noticed things that had escaped her attention before, subtle patterns of light that clung to certain buildings, shadows that moved independently of their casting objects, whispers in languages that her mind somehow understood, even as her ears failed to recognize them. The world itself seemed more alive, more layered with meanings and connections that ordinary sight could never perceive. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a glimpse into depths of reality that most people spent their entire lives blissfully unaware of. 3 days later, she returned to the deep forest. Bjarnulf was waiting for her in the same clearing. Where they had first met, seated on the fallen log with the patient stillness of one for whom time moved differently. He smiled as she emerged from between the trees, and she felt an answering warmth rise in her chest, not just gratitude, but something deeper and more complex. "You've been busy," he said, and she could hear approval in his deep voice. "Thanks to you," she replied, settling beside him on the log. The difference in their sizes should have been awkward, but somehow his presence made her feel not smaller, but more complete, as though she had been walking through life with a crucial part of herself missing. "The strength was always yours," he corrected gently. "I merely helped you remember how to access it, but that's only the beginning, Sigrid. What you've discovered is a tiny fraction of what you're truly capable of." As if to demonstrate his point, he reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was an arm ring, a band, of silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light, worked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. Runes covered its surface, carved with a precision that spoke of master craftsmanship and imbued with power that made the air around it shimmer. "This belonged to my mother," Bjarnulf said softly, holding the ring reverently. "She was the last of the giant blessed women to bear children who carried the full strength of the old bloodlines. When she died, I thought it would never find another worthy wearer." He extended the arm ring toward her, and she could feel the power radiating from it even before their skin touched. In the old traditions, such a gift has deep meaning. It signifies protection, yes, but also claiming, a recognition of bonds that transcend the merely physical. Sigrid's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the offered ring. She understood what he was telling her, understood the implications of accepting such a gift. To wear his mother's arm ring would be to acknowledge a connection between them that went far beyond the practical assistance he had provided in her healings. "I don't know if I'm ready for what you're suggesting," she whispered. "Readiness is a luxury we seldom have," he replied, his pale eyes holding hers with gentle intensity. "The question is not whether you're ready, but whether you're willing to become what you were always meant to be." She thought of the children she had saved, of the impossible herbs and the visions of light and shadow that had guided her healing. Hands. She thought of the emptiness that had consumed her life since Gunnar's death, and the sense of purpose that had awakened in Bjarnulf's presence. Slowly, she extended her arm. The moment the silver ring settled around her forearm, the world exploded into sensation. Power coursed through her veins like molten metal. Ancient knowledge flowered in her mind, like spring flowers bursting through snow, and her connection to Bjarnulf deepened into something that transcended mere physical proximity. She could feel his presence as a constant warmth in the back of her consciousness, could sense his emotions as clearly as her own. But most startling of all was the change in her own body. The aches and weariness of her 50-plus years seemed to melt away, replaced by a vitality she hadn't felt since her youth. Her vision sharpened, her hearing became more acute, and her skin took on a subtle luminescence that spoke of energies flowing just beneath the surface. "What's happening to me?" she gasped. "You're remembering who you truly are," Bjarnulf said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home, Sigrid of the Giant Blessed. Welcome to your true inheritance." The silver arm ring had been warm against Sigrid's skin for 2 weeks, when Bjarnulf finally spoke the words that changed everything she thought she knew about the man who had awakened her heritage. They were seated by the impossible stream that flowed upward through the heart of the thornwood, sharing the simple meal she had prepared from forest herbs and bread from Olaf's ovens. The ring caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, casting patterns of light that seemed to dance with lives of their own. "There are things about my past that you should know," Bjarnulf said, his deep voice carrying an unfamiliar weight of hesitation. "Stories that the skalds once sang around winter fires before the old ways began to fade." Something in his tone made Sigrid set down her portion of bread untouched. "What kind of stories?" Instead of answering immediately, he rose and walked to where a massive pine had fallen across the stream, its trunk forming a natural bridge between the banks. Carved into its bark, so weathered they were barely visible, were symbols that made her breath catch. She recognized some of them from her grandmother's tales, marks of great deeds, battle honors, the kind of runes that warriors earned through acts of legendary courage or terrible violence. But it was the weapon that truly told the story. Bjarnulf reached behind the fallen trunk and withdrew something that had clearly been hidden there for decades, if not longer. The war axe that emerged from its concealment was unlike anything Sigrid had ever seen, easily the length of her arm, from head to haft, its twin blades gleaming with an inner light that spoke of metal forged by more than ordinary fire. Runes covered every inch of its surface, and the handle was wrapped in leather that had been stained dark with what could only have been blood. "Skull splitter," he said simply, hefting the massive weapon as easily as she might lift her bone needle. "The Skalds gave it that name after the Battle of Raven's Crossing, when I held the ford alone against 300 men. The name struck her like a physical blow. Skull splitter was legend, the weapon carried by the giant warrior who had shaped the northern kingdoms through decades of warfare. Children learned the stories alongside their letters, tales of impossible battles won against overwhelming odds, of enemies crushed beneath the weight of the great axe, of a figure so large and terrible that armies would break and run at the mere sight of him on the battlefield. "You're him," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the singing of the upward-flowing stream. "You're the Bjarnulf, the Slaughter King, the one they called the Death-bringer." His pale eyes met hers across the clearing, and she saw in them the weight of centuries, the accumulated sorrow of battles fought and victories won at costs too terrible to calculate. "I am," he said simply, "though I haven't carried those names in over 100 years. The last great battle I fought was at Ironwall, defending King Magnus against the southern raiders. After that victory, I withdrew from the world of men and let the stories fade into legend." Sigrid's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her. The man she had been meeting in secret, the one whose touch had awakened powers she never knew. She possessed was the most feared warrior in the history of the northern lands. His battles had decided the fate of kingdoms. His name had been spoken in whispers to frighten children into obedience. "All those people," she said, her voice hollow. "All the death." "Yes," he said, and she heard no attempt at justification in his voice, no effort to minimize the weight of what he had done. "I was death incarnate for longer than most civilizations endure. I killed because it was what I was made for, what the blood in my veins demanded, what the world seemed to require of me." He set Skullsplitter aside with reverent care, but kept his hands resting on its haft. "But that was before I understood what the giant blood truly meant. Before I learned that power could create as well as destroy, that strength could protect as well as conquer." "When did you learn?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "The day I met a healer who reminded me that life was more precious than glory," he said, his eyes finding hers again. "A woman whose touch could mend what had been broken, whose presence could turn the tide against death itself. She showed me that the old blood could serve purposes beyond warfare." The words should have been reassuring, but Sigrid found herself struggling with the revelation of who he truly was. How could she reconcile the gentle giant who had gifted her impossible herbs with the legendary slaughterer whose axe had carved rivers of blood across the northern lands? How could the same hands that had crushed the life from countless enemies now touch her with such tenderness? As if sensing her internal struggle, Bjarnulf continued, "I won't lie to you about what I was, Sigrid. The songs were not exaggerated. If anything, they understated the scope of the destruction I brought to the world. But that was 5 centuries ago. I have spent the time since learning different lessons, exploring different aspects of what our bloodline can achieve." "What lessons?" she asked, though her voice carried a tremor she couldn't suppress. "That power without wisdom is mere brutality. that strength without compassion is worthless, that the ability to take life means nothing if you cannot also preserve it. He gestured to the impossible beauty of the forest around them, where flowers bloomed out of season and streams flowed against gravity. I learned to nurture instead of destroy, to create instead of conquer. Despite her shock at his revelation, Sigrid could not deny the evidence of her own experience. The man who had supported her healing work, who had gifted her the tools to save children's lives, who had awakened in her a sense of purpose she thought lost forever. That man seemed genuine in his desire to use power for protection rather than domination. "The village," she said suddenly, a new fear rising in her chest. "If they knew who you were, what you represent, they would come with torches and steel." "Yes," he agreed calmly. "The legends they remember paint me as a monster to be feared and destroyed. They would not understand that monsters can change, that even the bloodiest warrior can find redemption in the right cause." "And what cause is that?" she asked. His answer came without hesitation. "You. Your safety, your growth, your journey into the power that is your birthright. I have spent 500 years searching for another who carried the giant blood strongly, enough to awaken it. You are the first, Sigrid, and likely the last. If humanity is to remember the old ways, if the gifts of our people are to survive into the future, it will be through you." The weight of his words settled on her like a mantle. Of responsibility she had never asked for, yet she could not deny the truth of what he said. The power that flowed through her when she healed, the impossible abilities that had manifested since accepting his mother's ring. These were gifts that transcended ordinary human capability. "I'm still afraid," she admitted. "Good," he said, and something like approval warmed his voice. "Fear keeps us cautious, prevents us from becoming what we once were, but don't let fear prevent you from becoming what you could be." As if to demonstrate his point, he lifted Skull Splitter and held it out to her. The weapon was far too large for her to wield effectively, but when her fingers closed around the haft, she felt the same surge of recognition she had experienced. With the runestone, power calling to power, ancient strength acknowledging its heir, for just a moment, she saw through the axe's memory, felt the weight of it in battle, understood the terrible efficiency with which it had ended lives, sensed the burden of wielding such destructive force. But beneath the violence, she also felt something else, the desperate need to protect what was precious, the willingness to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. When she released the weapon, she was trembling, but not with fear. "I think I'm beginning to understand," she said. The ancient prophecies scroll felt brittle as parchment in Elder Tormund's weathered hands, its surface yellowed with age and covered in runes that few living souls could still decipher. He spread it carefully across the oak table in the village's council chamber, where the other elders had gathered in response to his urgent summons. "Read it aloud," commanded Elder Astrid the Wise, her milky eyes straining to make out the faded symbols. "Some of us have forgotten the old tongue." Tormund cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant knowledge as he translated the ancient words. "When the giant-born returns to walk among the small folk, when his blood calls to blood across the generations, then shall the old powers wake from their slumber. A woman blessed with his heritage shall rise, bearing gifts that shame the efforts of ordinary healers." He paused, glancing around at the faces of his fellow council members. They had all witnessed Sigrid's impossible healings over the past weeks, had seen her transform from failed outcast to miracle worker overnight. "The union of their bloodlines shall herald an age of change," he continued reading. "Either the small folk shall prosper under the guidance of the giant blessed, or they shall perish in the storms that follow the awakening of powers too great for mortal flesh to contain." The silence that followed his recitation was heavy with implication, Through the chamber's single window, they could see the evidence of the strange changes that had begun manifesting throughout Ironhold since Sigrid's remarkable recovery of purpose. Flowers bloomed in frozen gardens, wells that had run dry for years suddenly flowed with sweet water, and livestock bore healthy offspring despite the harsh winter weather. Yet for every blessing, there were signs that unsettled the more traditional villagers. Animals behaved strangely, gathering in unusual patterns as though listening to voices only they could hear. The aurora that had always danced across the northern sky now appeared with unnatural frequency, painting the night in colors that had no names. And there were the dreams, vivid shared visions that visited the villagers in sleep, showing them glimpses of a past when giants walked the earth as commonly as ordinary men. 3 more children have recovered from illnesses that should have claimed them, Elder Ragnar reported, his thick fingers drumming nervously against the table's surface. Sigrid's touch seems to cure ailments that have baffled healers for generations. And where does such power come from? Demanded Elder Sven, the youngest of the council but perhaps the most conservative in his thinking. What price do we pay for these miracles? The prophecy speaks of storms to follow. What if our acceptance of her gifts brings catastrophe upon us all? Tormund folded the prophecy scroll with careful reverence, but his expression remained troubled. There have been other signs. Young women speak of meeting her in the deep forest, learning healing arts that surpass anything we have seen before. They return with knowledge they should not possess, abilities that exceed natural learning. It was true. In the weeks since Sigrid's transformation, a growing number of the village's women had begun seeking her out in secret. They returned with eyes that gleamed with newfound confidence and hands that seemed to hold traces of her supernatural ability. Where once there had been only Freydis to tend the sick, now there were 6 women who could perform minor healings, ease difficult births, and calm troubled minds with touches that bordered on the magical. Perhaps that is not entirely a misfortune, suggested Elder Astrid quietly. How many winters have we watched children die for lack of sufficient healing knowledge? How many mothers have we lost to birthing complications that might have been prevented? If Sigrid can teach others to prevent such tragedies, at what cost? Sven interrupted. Look at her, Astrid. Truly look at her. The woman who walks our streets today is not the same person who failed to save 3 children just months ago. Her very presence has changed. She moves with the confidence of someone who knows secrets the rest of us cannot fathom. Her eyes hold depths that speak of powers beyond our understanding. Tormund nodded grimly. He had observed the same transformation, had watched Sigrid evolve from a broken woman grieving her lost purpose into something that transcended ordinary human capability. The changes were subtle but undeniable. The way she seemed to glide rather than walk, the manner in which small animals approached her without fear, the aura of vitality that surrounded her like visible heat. And there is the matter of her appearance, Ragnar added reluctantly. Sigrid has seen more than 50 winters, yet she grows younger looking with each passing day. Her hair regains its color, her skin loses its lines, her back straightens as though age itself is reversing its course. This was perhaps the most unsettling change of all. The silver threading through Sigrid's dark hair had begun to fade, replaced by lustrous brown that gleamed with health. The lines around her eyes had softened, and she carried herself with the posture of a woman decades younger. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, proof that forces beyond nature were at work in their midst. The prophecy speaks of a union, Tormund continued, his voice heavy with implication. The blood calling to blood. If Sigrid truly carries the giant heritage, then there must be another, one whose bloodline calls to hers. The elders exchanged worried glances. They had all heard the whispers, the rumors of a massive figure glimpsed at the forest's edge, tracks too large for any ordinary man, trees found broken in patterns that suggested something of immense size. Moving through the deep woods, "The giant born," whispered Astrid, fear making her voice quaver. "The legends say he was death incarnate, that armies fled rather than face his wrath. If such a creature has truly returned, then we must decide what course to take," Tormund finished grimly. "Do we embrace the changes and hope the prophecy's promise of prosperity proves true? Or do we act to prevent the union it describes, knowing that our actions might doom us all?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Outside, the unnatural aurora painted the sky in shades of green and gold, while somewhere in the distance a wolf howled with a voice that sounded almost human. Elder Sven was the first to break the silence. "I say we cannot risk it. The legends of the giant-born speak of nothing but destruction and death. If Sigrid has truly awakened such powers, if she is indeed drawing the attention of creatures from the old stories, then we must act before it is too late." "Act how?" Ragnar demanded. "What would you have us do? Exile the woman who has saved more lives in recent weeks than all our other healers combined? Drive away the one person who might be able to protect us if true danger threatens?" "I would. Have us remember that power without restraint leads to tyranny," Sven replied hotly. "Today she heals our children, but what happens when she decides our ways are too small for her enlarged capabilities? What happens when she concludes that we are obstacles to whatever grand destiny she believes awaits her?" Tormund studied the prophecy scroll in his hands, weighing the terrible responsibility that had fallen upon them. As the eldest member of the council, the final decision would ultimately rest with him. Yet how could any mortal man choose between the promise of unprecedented prosperity and the risk of unleashing forces that might destroy everything they held dear? "We will watch," he said finally. "We will observe closely and prepare for all possibilities, but we will not act precipitously against one who has shown us nothing but kindness. The prophecy speaks of choice, that the union of bloodlines will bring either prosperity or catastrophe. Perhaps the decision lies not with us, but with Sigrid herself." "And if we choose wrong?" Sven asked quietly. Tormund's answer carried the weight of ages. "Then we will face the consequences as our ancestors faced theirs, with courage, with honor, and with the hope that our sacrifice might preserve something worthy for those who come after." As if summoned by his words, the aurora flared brighter outside the window, and in its shifting light they could have sworn they saw the silhouette of a figure too large to be entirely human, watching their village from the edge of the ancient forest. The sound of splintering stone echoed through the village square like thunder, drawing every soul in Ironhold from their morning tasks to witness what Elder Sven called the cleansing of corruption. Gunnar's memorial stone, the granite marker that had stood at the square's center for 3 years, carved with runes of remembrance and honor, lay in fragments beneath the heavy sledgehammers wielded by the more zealous villagers. "It is done," Sven declared, his face flushed with the fervor of one convinced of his own righteousness. "No longer will this monument to unnatural attachment anchor the widow's spirit to our world. No longer will it serve as a conduit for the dark forces that have corrupted her healing gifts." But as the dust settled and the crowd began to disperse, young Astrid's voice rose in alarm. "Elder Sven, look at what you've uncovered." Where the memorial stone had stood, its destruction had revealed something that made the gathering. Crowd gasp in collective shock. Hidden beneath the carefully laid foundation stones were older markings, runes carved into the bedrock itself, so ancient their style predated anything in the village's recorded history. But it was not their age that sent whispers of fear and wonder through the assembled villagers. It was their meaning. Sigrid arrived at the square to find a circle of stunned faces surrounding the exposed carvings. Her heart clenched at the sight of Gunnar's destroyed memorial, but something about the ancient markings beneath drew her attention with magnetic force. As she knelt beside the broken stone, the silver arm ring on her forearm began to pulse with warm recognition. "Can anyone read these?" Elder Tormund asked. his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious significance of the discovery. "I can," said a voice from the crowd's edge, and all eyes turned to see old Henrik, the village's lawkeeper and the only man alive who still remembered the eldest forms of the runic alphabet. He approached the exposed carvings with trembling steps, his weathered hands hovering over the stone as though afraid to touch what had been revealed. "These are giant runes," he whispered, his voice carrying across the square despite its softness. "Older than our settlement, older than our people's memory. They speak of—" He paused, his face pale with shock. "They speak of bloodlines, of protection, of a sacred trust." "What kind of trust?" Sigrid asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Henrik's eyes found hers across the circle, and she saw in them a mixture of awe and fear. "They mark this place as a sanctuary for the giant blessed, a haven where those who carry the old blood can find safety and recognition." He swallowed hard before continuing. "But more than that, they identify the guardian family, the bloodline chosen to protect and preserve the ancient heritage." The silence that followed his words was so complete that the sound of wind through the square seemed loud as a storm. "Which family?" Tormund asked. Though his tone suggested he suspected the answer, Henrik's gnarled finger traced the complex patterns carved into the stone, following spirals and interconnected symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The line of Eriksdottir," he said finally, "the family that has provided healers to this village for 7 generations, the family that—" His voice trailed off as the implications became clear. "My family," Sigrid finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some drew back in fear, others pushed forward in fascination, and a few fell to their knees as though in the presence of something sacred. But Sigrid heard none of their exclamations, saw none of their gestures. Her attention was focused entirely on the ancient carvings, which seemed to be telling her a story she had never known but had always been living. "There's more," Henrik continued, his scholarly excitement overcoming his fear. "These runes, they don't just speak of guardianship. They tell of preparation, of bloodlines carefully preserved across generations, waiting for the time when they would be needed again." He looked up at Sigrid with wonder. "Your grandmother was giant blessed, as was her grandmother before her. The healing gifts that have run through your family for generations, they were never purely human abilities." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Every story her grandmother had told her, every technique passed down through the maternal line, every instinctive understanding of herbs and anatomy that had seemed natural, all of it took on new meaning in light of what the ancient stones revealed. "But that's not all," Henrik said, his voice growing stronger as he deciphered more of the complex inscription. "The runes speak of a covenant, a promise made between the giant blessed bloodlines. When the time of awakening comes, when the old powers stir again, the guardian family will be marked by specific signs." "What signs?" Elder Tormund demanded. Henrik's eyes met Sigrid's across the ruined memorial. "The power to heal beyond ordinary ability, the capacity to see sickness and health as patterns of light, the gift of fertility even in advanced years." His voice dropped to a whisper, "and the calling of a mate from the pure giant bloodlines, drawn by the scent of awakened heritage." The crowd's murmur rose to a roar as the implications became clear. Bjarnulf's strange knowledge of her condition, his ability to provide impossible herbs, his claim that he could smell her fertility, it had never been the random encounter she had assumed. It had been destiny, written in stone before her village, had even existed, but the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "The final inscription," Henrik said, his voice trembling with the weight of what he was about to reveal, "speaks of the ultimate purpose of the guardian bloodline. When the time comes, when the old powers wake fully, the giant blessed woman will face a choice. She can use her gifts to bridge the gap between the old world and the new, bringing prosperity to both giant and human bloodlines." Or what?" Sigrid asked, though she dreaded the answer. Or she can reclaim the full power of her heritage, becoming what the ancients called a völva, a seer queen with dominion over life and death itself. But such power comes at a cost. To claim it fully, she would have to abandon her connection to ordinary humanity forever. The implications of Hendrik's words settled over the crowd like a burial shroud. Sigrid was not merely a woman whose healing gifts had mysteriously returned. She was the latest in an unbroken line of guardians, bred and trained across generations to serve a purpose none of them had fully understood until this moment. "The prophecy we found speaks the truth," Tormund said quietly, but it was not a warning of what might come. It was a record of what was always meant to be. Sigrid felt the world shifting around her, old certainties crumbling like the destroyed memorial stone. Her marriage to Gunnar, her years of dedication to healing, even her grief and isolation, all of it had been preparation for this moment. This choice between the human world she had always known and a destiny that had been carved in stone before her birth. But there was one more surprise waiting in the ancient runes. As Henrik continued his translation, his face grew even paler. "There is something else," he said, his voice barely audible. "The stones speak of a sign that will mark the time of choosing. When the guardian carries new life within her, when the old blood quickens with the promise of the next generation, then the decision cannot be delayed." All eyes turned to Sigrid, and she felt the truth of it like fire in her veins. The changes in her body, the reversal of age, the impossible fertility Bjarnulf had detected, it was all coming together in ways that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She was pregnant, despite her advanced years, despite the laws of nature that should have made such a thing impossible. She carried within her the child that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of both human and giant bloodlines. The crowd fell silent as the full weight of revelation settled upon them. Their village healer was not just a woman blessed with unusual gifts. She was the culmination of centuries of careful breeding, the guardian of powers older than civilization, and the mother of a child who would inherit abilities that could reshape the world. The only question that remained was what she would choose to do with such power, and whether the choice would even be hers to make. The crown of winters lay before Sigrid, like a challenge written in starlight and ancient silver, its crystalline surface catching the pale light filtering through the cave's opening and throwing patterns of rainbow fire across the stone walls. Bjarnulf had led her deep into the heart of the Thornwood, to a shrine carved from living rock where the last giant queen had once held court over both human and Jotun subjects. "It belonged to Grimhild the Wise," Bjarnulf said softly, his voice echoing in the sacred space. "My great-grandmother, the last of the giant blessed women to rule with the full power of the old bloodlines. When she died, the crown was placed here to await another worthy of its burden." The circlet was unlike anything Sigrid had ever imagined. Wrought from silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was set with crystals that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The metal itself was carved with runes so intricate they seemed to move in her peripheral vision, telling stories of power wielded with wisdom, of choices made for the good of all peoples, of sacrifices that had preserved hope through the darkest of ages. But it was not just its beauty that made Sigrid hesitate to approach the ancient artifact. Power radiated from the crown like heat from a forge, and she could sense that touching it would change her in ways that could never be undone. "The pregnancy progresses faster than it should," she said, her hand moving instinctively to her slightly rounded belly. In the 6 weeks since the revelation at the destroyed memorial stone, her body had changed in ways that defied natural law. What should have been the earliest stages of carrying a child had accelerated into something that looked like 4 months of normal development. "Giant children grow quickly," Bjarnulf confirmed, his pale eyes reflecting the crown's ethereal light. especially when their mothers are coming into their full power. But that very speed creates danger for you and for the child. Your human heritage fights against the awakening giant blood, creating internal conflicts that could destroy you both. It was true. Sigrid had felt the struggle within her own body, the war between what she had always been and what she was becoming. Some days she woke feeling vital and strong, her healing abilities flowing through her like liquid sunshine. Other days she could barely rise from her bed, her body racked with pains that spoke of fundamental changes occurring at the deepest levels of her being. The crown would stabilize the transformation, Bjarnulf continued, his voice gentle but urgent. It would allow you to access your full heritage without the dangerous conflict between bloodlines. But wearing it would also make you what Grimhild was. A bridge between worlds, yes, but also something beyond purely human understanding. Through the cave's opening, Sigrid could see the first signs of the storm that had been building for days. The sky had taken on an unnatural color, like pewter shot through with veins of deep green, and the wind carried voices that spoke in languages older than memory. The aurora that should have been visible only at night now danced across the afternoon sky in curtains of impossible beauty and power. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a decision that would determine the fate of more than just one village or one woman. Animals had begun gathering in the deeper woods, not just the ordinary creatures of the thornwood, but things that should not have existed. Wolves the size of horses, bears with silver fur that gleamed like metal, ravens whose eyes held intelligence that bordered on human. The village prepares for war, Sigrid said quietly, though war seemed too small a word for what was building between Ironhold and the forces that Bjarnulf represented. Elder Sven had spent the week since the revelation rallying support from neighboring settlements, spreading word that a giant had returned to threaten their peaceful existence. His messages had found fertile ground in communities still raised on stories of the legendary Slaughter King, still haunted by tales of the destruction Bjarnulf had once brought to the northern kingdoms, but the response had not been uniform. Some settlements had indeed sent warriors, men armed with blessed steel and hearts full of righteous fear. Others had sent observers, curious to see if the legends of the giant blessed healers might prove true. A few had sent their own wise women, elders who remembered older stories, tales that spoke of the giant bloodlines as protectors rather than destroyers. Astrid leads those who support you, Bjarnulf said, noting the direction of her thoughts. Young women mostly, and a few of the older healers who remember what true power looks like. They understand that what you offer is not conquest, but preservation, the chance to recover abilities that could benefit all people. It was true. In the weeks since her heritage had been revealed, Sigrid had found herself the center of a growing community of women who sought to learn from her expanded knowledge. She had taught them techniques for sensing illness before symptoms appeared, methods for channeling their own life force into healing energy, ways of seeing the patterns of health and sickness that ordinary sight could never detect. Under her guidance, Ironhold had begun to experience a renaissance of healing. Arts, childhood diseases that had claimed lives for generations were now treatable. Difficult births became manageable. Even injuries that should have left permanent damage could be healed without lasting consequences. But such dramatic changes inevitably created fear among those who preferred the familiar struggles to unknown. Possibilities. Olaf has been forging weapons, Sigrid said, her voice heavy with sorrow. Blessed steel, he calls it, though I suspect the blessings come more from fear than divine guidance. Even he, one of the few who showed me kindness in my darkest days, now sees me as something to be contained or destroyed. The betrayal hurt more than she wanted to admit. Olaf's daughter had been among the first to seek out Sigrid's teaching, and the young woman's rapid advancement in healing arts had filled the blacksmith with pride. But as the supernatural nature of those gifts became undeniable, pride had transformed into suspicion, and suspicion into active preparation for conflict. They "Gather at the village outskirts," Bjarnulf said, his senses far sharper than any ordinary human's. "Perhaps 60 fighters from Ironhold and the neighboring settlements, armed with steel and blessed silver, hearts full of stories that paint me as a monster to be slain. They mean to end this before your child can be born, before the prophecies can reach their fulfillment." Sigrid felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders like a funeral shroud. She could flee deeper into the forest with Bjarnulf, abandoning the village that had been her home, but preserving the life growing within her. She could attempt to negotiate, to convince the gathered warriors that their fears were unfounded. Or she could claim the power that the Crown of Winters offered, accepting the transformation that would give her the strength to protect both herself and those she cared about. "What would Grimhild have done?" she asked. Bjarnulf's expression grew distant as he considered the question. "She would have chosen the path that preserved the most lives, even if it meant sacrificing her own humanity in the process." The giant queens were not rulers in the way human kings understand leadership. They were guardians, protectors whose power existed to serve rather than to dominate. The crown seemed to pulse brighter at his words, as though responding to the recognition of its true purpose. Sigrid could feel its call growing stronger, could sense the vast reservoir of knowledge and ability that waited within its crystalline structure. Healing arts beyond anything she had yet imagined, the power to sense and influence the natural world, the ability to see across vast distances and understand the connections that bound all living things together. But she could also sense the price of such gifts. To wear the Crown of Winters would mean accepting responsibilities that extended far beyond her small village, or even her own lifetime. She would become something eternal, a guardian whose duties would span generations, whose choices would echo through centuries of consequence. "The child," she said, her hand again moving to her belly. "What becomes of the child if I choose the crown?" "The child becomes what he was always meant to be," Bjarnulf replied, "the first of a new generation, carrying both bloodlines in perfect balance. He would grow to be a bridge between human and giant heritage, capable of teaching both peoples to live together as they did in the ancient days." The thought filled her with both hope and terror. To bear a child who could reshape the relationship between humans and the supernatural world was a responsibility beyond imagining. Yet the alternative, allowing fear and ignorance to destroy, the last chance for such reconciliation, seemed even more terrible. "How long do we have?" she asked, though the increasing intensity of the storm outside suggested the answer. "Hours, perhaps less," Bjarnulf said. "The warriors will move with the falling darkness, hoping to use stealth and numbers to overcome what they perceive as supernatural advantages. They don't understand that surprise means nothing against senses that can detect heartbeats from miles away." Sigrid approached the Crown of Winters slowly, each step requiring enormous effort of will. The artifact's power seemed to reach out to her, promising answers to questions she had never known how to ask, offering abilities that could heal, not just individuals but entire communities. Yet she could also sense the loneliness that would come with such power, the isolation of being something more than human in a world that feared what it could not understand. "If I choose this path," she said softly, "will I still be me?" Bjarnulf's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, his touch warm despite the cold, radiating from the ancient cave. "You will be more yourself than you have ever been," he said. "The crown doesn't change who you are, Sigrid. It simply allows you to become everything you were always meant to be." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the forest outside the cave, many footsteps moving with the careful coordination of warriors advancing toward battle. The time for contemplation had ended. The Crown of Winters waited, offering power and responsibility in equal measure, while outside the representatives of human fear prepared to destroy what they could not comprehend. The choice could no longer be delayed. The first contraction struck Sigrid like lightning, doubling her over as the warriors' torches flickered through the trees beyond the sacred cave. The timing could not have been worse, or perhaps, she thought, through the haze of sudden pain, it was exactly as it was meant to be. The child who had grown impossibly fast during her weeks of transformation was demanding to be born at the very moment her old life was ending and her new destiny began. Now, Bjarnulf's voice carried disbelief and fierce protectiveness in equal measure as he caught her trembling form. "The child chooses now to come into the world," another contraction answered him, this one so powerful it drove Sigrid to her knees on the cave's stone floor. But even through the pain, she could sense something extraordinary happening. The crown of winters, still glowing on its ancient pedestal, pulsed in rhythm with her labor, as though the artifact and the child within her were connected by invisible threads of power. "The birthmark," she gasped between contractions, remembering something from the ancient prophecies Henrik had translated. The old texts spoke of a mark that would prove. Her words dissolved into a cry as the next wave of pain crashed over her. Through the cave's opening, the sound of approaching warriors grew clearer. Elder Sven's voice carried above the others, harsh with religious fervor. "The corruption ends tonight. The giant spawn and his witch will not see another dawn." Bjarnulf's expression darkened with an anger that Sigrid had never seen in him before. This was not the gentle giant who had courted her with impossible herbs and patient wisdom. This was the legendary warrior whose name had once struck terror into the hearts of entire armies. Skull Splitter materialized in his massive hands as though summoned by his rage, its ancient steel gleaming with supernatural light. "Stay with the child," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to battlefields. "I will—" "No." Sigrid's word cut through his mounting fury with surprising strength. "This is not the old way, the way of blood and vengeance. If we meet their fear with violence, we prove everything they believe about us." "They mean to kill you," Bjarnulf said, his knuckles white around the axe's handle, "to murder our child before it draws its first breath. How can mercy answer such hatred?" Another contraction answered for her, this one bringing with it a rush of sensations that transcended ordinary pain. She could feel the child moving within her, could sense its eagerness to emerge into a world that would either embrace or destroy it, based on choices made in the next few moments. "The crown," she said, her voice steady despite the agony coursing through her body. "Help me reach the crown." Bjarnulf's eyes widened with understanding. "Sigrid, if you claim it now, during the birthing, the power could be overwhelming. Your human body might not survive the transformation. And if I don't claim it, we'll all die anyway," she replied, struggling to rise from the cold stone. "At least this way, our child has a chance." The sound of footsteps had reached the cave's entrance. Through the opening, she could see torch flames dancing against the twilight, could hear the whispered prayers and muttered curses of men preparing to commit what they believed was a righteous act. With Bjarnulf's help, Sigrid reached the pedestal, where the crown of winters waited. The artifact seemed to recognize her approach, its crystalline elements blazing with anticipation. But as her trembling hands reached for it, another voice cut through the night. "Wait." Astrid burst through the line of warriors, her face flushed with exertion and desperate determination. Behind her came a small group of women, healers and mothers, daughters and grandmothers who had learned from Sigrid in recent weeks. They formed a protective circle around the cave's entrance, their bodies serving as a barrier between the armed men and the woman in labor within. "You would murder a woman giving birth?" Astrid challenged, her voice carrying across the clearing with remarkable authority. "What honor is there in such an act? What righteousness in slaying a child before it draws breath?" Elder Sven pushed through the ranks of warriors, his face twisted with fanatical certainty. "That is no ordinary child. The prophecies speak of spawn that will bring ruin to our people, of giants returned to claim dominion over the earth." "The prophecies speak of choice," countered another voice, and Sigrid was amazed to see young Henrik step forward from the group of women. "Of prosperity that could come to all peoples if fear does not triumph over wisdom." The standoff held for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Armed men faced unarmed women across a space of perhaps 20 feet, while within the cave, powers older than civilization waited to be claimed or rejected. That was when the child's cry filled the night air. Sigrid had barely registered the final contraction, her consciousness divided between the confrontation outside and the crown whose surface she had finally touched. The moment her fingers made contact with the ancient metal, power flooded through her in torrents that threatened to wash away everything she had ever been. But through it all, she heard her child's first breath, felt the small, warm weight settling against her chest as Bjarnulf wrapped both mother and infant in his massive cloak. "The birthmark," Bjarnulf whispered, his voice filled with wonder and recognition. On the child's tiny shoulder, clearly visible in the crown's supernatural light, was a mark that seemed to have been drawn by the gods themselves, a spiral pattern that matched exactly the runes carved into the deepest stones of the ancient shrine. It was proof, undeniable and magnificent, that this child was indeed the one foretold in prophecy. The crying stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and in the profound silence that followed, every person present, warrior and healer, believer and skeptic, felt the weight of destiny settling upon them all. The crown of winters settled onto Sigrid's brow, like destiny taking physical form, its ancient crystals pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat and the gentle breathing of the child in her arms. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Power flooded through her veins like liquid starlight, and suddenly she could see the world as it truly was. Every person in the clearing appeared to her enhanced vision as a pattern of light and shadow, their emotions visible as colors that swirled around their bodies like living aurora. The warriors' fear blazed red-orange against the night, while their determination showed as hard lines of steel-gray purpose. But beneath the fear, she could see deeper truths. These were not evil men, but frightened ones, trying to protect families and homes from what they could not understand. The women who had formed a protective circle around the cave entrance glowed with softer hues, the warm gold of loyalty, the deep blue of hope, the gentle green of compassion. And threading through all of them, connecting every soul in the clearing, whether they realized it or not, were silver strands of shared humanity that pulsed with the rhythm of collective heartbeats. "Behold," Elder Sven declared, his voice cracking with vindicated terror as he pointed toward the cave. "The witch claims the demon crown. See how she transforms into something unhuman." It was true that changes were occurring in Sigrid's appearance, but they were not the monstrous alterations Sven's words suggested. Her hair, already returned to its youthful brown, now gleamed with threads of silver that seemed to hold captured starlight. Her skin took on a luminescence that spoke of power barely contained within mortal flesh. Most dramatically, her eyes now held depths that seemed to reflect not just the immediate scene, but centuries of accumulated wisdom. Yet when she spoke, her voice carried the same gentle authority it always had, unchanged despite the cosmic forces flowing through her. "Put down your weapons," she said, rising from the cave floor with fluid grace despite having given birth moments before. "There will be no violence here tonight." The command carried power beyond mere words. It resonated through the clearing, like a bell struck in a cathedral, reaching into the hearts of every person present and demanding acknowledgement. Several of the younger warriors actually took a step backward, their hands loosening on sword hilts and spear shafts. But Elder Sven's fanaticism proved stronger than supernatural compulsion. "Do not listen to her honeyed lies," he shouted, raising his blessed silver blade high above his head. "She seeks to bewitch us all, to make us slaves to her giant master." He lunged forward with surprising speed for a man of his years, the blessed blade aimed directly at Sigrid's heart. But he never reached his target. Bjarnulf moved with the fluid precision that had made him legendary on a dozen battlefields, Skullsplitter appearing in his hands as though materialized from shadow itself. The great axe swept in a perfect arc, its edge meeting Sven's blade, with a sound like thunder splitting stone. The blessed silver shattered like glass against the ancient steel, fragments scattering across the clearing in glittering streams. Sven stumbled backward, his face pale with shock at the ease with which his weapon had been destroyed. "Enough," Bjarnulf said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of ages. "I am Bjarnulf Ironbreaker, called Skull Splitter in the old songs, and I have ended more lives than there are stars in the winter sky. But I did not come here to add to that tally." He planted Skull Splitter point first in the earth before him, both hands resting on its handle in a gesture that somehow managed to be both threatening and peaceful. "I came here seeking not conquest, but connection, not to rule over humanity, but to find my place beside it." The warriors murmured among themselves, caught between the legends they had grown up with and the reality of the man before them. This was indeed the figure from their darkest stories, but his words spoke of purposes they had never imagined. "The child," Astrid called out, her voice cutting through the tension. "Let us see the child." Sigrid stepped forward, the crown of winters casting rainbow patterns across the clearing as its crystals caught and refracted the torchlight. In her arms, the newborn stirred gently, his tiny face peaceful despite the chaos surrounding his birth. But it was not the child's peaceful expression that drew gasps from the assembled crowd. It was the rune stone that had appeared in his tiny fist. The fragment that had first called to Sigrid in the deep forest now rested in her son's grasp, transformed by his touch into something new, where once it had been merely warm stone carved. With ancient symbols, it now pulsed with golden light that seemed to emanate from within its crystal structure. The runes on its surface moved and shifted like living things, telling stories of unity rather than division, of bridges built between worlds that had grown apart. "The transformed healing stone," whispered Henrik, his scholarly mind immediately grasping the significance of what they were witnessing. The prophecies spoke of this, the sign that would mark the beginning of a new age. The light from the stone began to spread, touching each person in the clearing with gentle warmth that seemed to reach directly into their hearts. Fear began to dissolve like frost before sunrise, replaced by wonder and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Even elder Sven lowered his broken weapon, his face reflecting the golden radiance that now filled the sacred space around the ancient cave. 6 months had passed since the night when fear nearly triumphed over wisdom, and the village of Ironhold bore little resemblance to the divided, struggling community it had once been. Where the destroyed memorial stone had once stood, a new shrine now rose, not built by human hands alone, but shaped through the combined efforts of both ordinary craftsmanship and supernatural guidance. The new village shrine was unlike anything the northern lands had ever seen. Carved from living stone that had been coaxed rather than forced into its current form, it bore symbols from both human and giant traditions, creating a visual testament to the unity that had emerged from conflict. At its heart stood the transformed runestone, no longer a small fragment but grown into a crystalline pillar that pulsed with gentle golden light, serving as a beacon visible for miles in every direction. Sigrid approached the shrine in the early morning light. Her son Eric, named for the child whose death had first driven her into the deep forest, cradled against her chest. At 6 months, the boy was already larger and more alert than ordinary children of his age, but his eyes held a gentleness that spoke of his dual heritage. The birthmark on his shoulder had evolved into an intricate pattern that seemed to map the connections between all living things, beautiful and profound in its complexity. The crown of winters no longer adorned her brow. She had learned to access its power without wearing it constantly, keeping it safely stored, except for times when the full weight of her authority was needed. But the changes it had wrought in her remained visible to those who knew how to look. Her hair held permanent threads of starlight silver. Her eyes reflected depths that spoke of wisdom gathered from sources beyond ordinary experience, and her presence carried an aura of calm authority that made even the most skeptical villagers feel safe in her company. "The morning looks promising," said a familiar voice, and Sigrid turned to see Astrid approaching with a basket of fresh bread and the confidence that had made her Ironhold's new elected leader. The young mother had grown into her role with remarkable grace, guiding the village through its transformation with a combination of practical wisdom and openness to change that had impressed even the most traditional elders. "The southern delegation arrives today," Sigrid replied, settling onto one of the stone benches that surrounded the shrine. "Word of what we've accomplished here has spread further than I expected." It was true. Representatives from dozens of settlements across the northern kingdoms had come to see for themselves what they had heard were impossible tales. A village where sickness had become almost unknown, where crops grew in abundance despite harsh weather, where the old enmities between different peoples had given way to cooperation and mutual respect. "Bjarnulf is teaching the young men again today," Astrid noted, her tone carrying approval rather than the fear such words would have inspired months earlier. "Olaf says his son has learned more about metalworking in a few weeks than he managed in years of traditional apprenticeship." The blacksmith had been among the most resistant to change, but he had also been among the most dramatically won over when Bjarnulf had demonstrated techniques for working metal that produced tools and weapons of unprecedented quality. The legendary warrior's knowledge of craftsmanship proved as extensive as his reputation for battle, and his willingness to share that knowledge freely had transformed him from a figure of terror into one of respect. "And Freydis continues her own studies," Sigrid added with satisfaction. The younger healer had initially seen Sigrid's return to prominence as a threat to her own position, but she had proven remarkably adaptable when offered the chance to learn healing techniques that far surpassed anything in her previous training. Now Ironhold boasted not one remarkable healer, but half a dozen, each trained in methods that combined traditional knowledge with insights drawn from the giant bloodlines. Children who would once have died from winter fevers now recovered completely. Women who would have perished in childbirth now delivered healthy babies with minimal difficulty. Even injuries that would have left permanent damage could be healed, so completely that no trace remained. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Elder Tormund making his careful way along the path that led to the shrine. The old man moved slowly these days, but his eyes were clear, and his expression held the contentment of one who had lived to see changes he had once thought impossible. "The morning blessing?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench with a grunt of effort. This had become their daily ritual, a brief ceremony where Sigrid would channel power through the shrine's crystalline heart, sending waves of healing energy throughout the village and its surrounding lands. It was not magic in the flashy sense that stories suggested, but rather a gentle reinforcement of natural processes, an encouragement for all living things to grow strong and healthy. As she placed her hand on the warm crystal surface, Sigrid felt the familiar surge of connection, not just to the power that flowed through her, but to every life touched by that power. She could sense the contentment of well-fed livestock, the vitality of thriving crops, the peaceful sleep of healthy children, the satisfaction of adults engaged in meaningful work. But most clearly of all, she could feel Bjarnulf's presence at the village's edge, where he worked with the young craftsmen who had overcome their fear to learn from his centuries of experience. Their bond had deepened rather than diminished with time, creating a partnership that strengthened both of them while serving the needs of their adopted community. "Do you ever regret it?" Tormund asked quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "The choice to embrace what you became rather than remaining what you were." Sigrid considered the question as the morning light strengthened around them, illuminating the bustling activity of a village transformed. Children played safely in gardens that bloomed with impossible abundance. Adults moved with the confidence of people whose basic needs were met and whose futures held promise rather than merely survival. The air itself seemed cleaner, charged, with vitality that made every breath a small celebration. "How can I regret becoming who I was always meant to be?" she replied, lifting Eric so he could see the world that would be his inheritance. "How can I regret choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, the difficult path toward growth over the easy path toward stagnation?" As if in response to her words, the transformed runestone pulsed brighter, sending ripples of golden light across the shrine's carved surfaces. In that light, both she and Tormund could see the true scope of what had been accomplished. Not just the healing of one village, but the preservation of knowledge and abilities that could transform the entire relationship between humanity and the natural world. The ancient bone needle rested in its place of honor within the shrine, no longer a tool of desperate last resort, but a symbol of the healing arts that had been preserved and enhanced through the marriage of human wisdom and giant power. Beside it lay the silver arm ring and the other artifacts that had marked the stages of her journey, each one a reminder of choices made and challenges overcome. Young Eric gurgled contentedly in her arms, his tiny fingers reaching toward the patterns of light that danced around the shrine. In his innocent gaze, Sigrid could see the future, a world where the old divisions had healed, where the gifts of all peoples could be shared freely, where power served to protect rather than dominate. The morning blessing was complete, but the real work was just beginning.